It was mid-afternoon. The tropical sun blazed overhead, a veritable ball of fire. The jungle lay still and silent under its scorching spell. Even the birds and monkeys that had chattered all morning were now quiet. Beneath the dark shadows of the forest trees, some relief was to be found from the golden glare. The heavy stillness was occasionally broken by a hollow sound from the wooden bells hanging from the necks of a herd of cattle that had been driven into the jungle for grazing. These wooden bells serve two purposes. The first and main object is to enable the herdsmen to locate in the thick underbrush the whereabouts of the animals that wear them. The second object is to frighten off any carnivora that becomes disposed to attack the wearers. Quite often, the second purpose is successfully achieved, as tigers and panthers are suspicious animals and hesitate to attack a prey from whose neck is suspended a strange wooden object emitting queer sounds. But sometimes again the ruse does not succeed, depending upon the nature of the particular tiger or panther concerned, and even more on its hunger at the given moment. This particular afternoon was to witness one such exception. A fat and brown young bull was browsing on the outskirts of the herd, munching mouthfuls of grass beneath the shade of a clump of ficus trees. With each mouthful that it tore from the ground, it would raise its head a little, to gaze in idle speculation at the surrounding jungle. While its jaws worked steadily, munching the grass, nothing seemed to stir, and the brown bull was at peace with itself and the world. It would not have felt so complacent, however, if it had gazed behind. Not a rustle rose as a tuft of grass parted, to show two malevolent green eyes that stared with concentrated longing at the fat brown bull. The eyes were those of a large male panther, of the big forest variety, and his heavy body, nearly equaling that of a tigress in dimensions, was pressed low to the ground, the coloring of his rosettes merging naturally with the various tints of the grasses. Slowly and noiselessly, the panther drew his hind legs to a crouching position. His muscles quivered and vibrated with tenseness. His whole form swayed gently to gain balance for the death charge that was to follow. Then, as a bolt from the blue, that charge took place. As a streak of yellow and black spots, the heavy body of the panther hurtled through the air, and, before the brown bull was aware that anything was happening, the cruel yellow fangs buried themselves in its jugular. For a moment, the bull struggled to maintain its equilibrium with its 4 feet apart, hoping to gallop into the midst of the grazing herd. But with its air supply cut off, and its lifeblood jetting from the torn throat, its resistance was but momentary. It crashed to earth with a thud, all 4 feet lashing out desperately in an attempt to kick off the attacker. The panther adroitly squirmed his body out of reach of the lashing hooves, but never released his merciless grip on the bull's throat. A snorting gurgle burst from the gaping mouth of the stricken animal. The feet kicked less vigorously, and then its terror-stricken eyes slowly took on a glazed and lifeless expression, as death came within a few minutes of the attack. Thus, the herdsman lose one of his best beasts, as the rest of the herd, alarmed by the noise made by the dying bull, galloped through the jungle for safety to the forest line that eventually led to the village a couple of miles away. In the next 3 months, he lost 4 more of his cattle, while the other 2 herdsmen, who lived in the same village, each lost a couple. On the other hand, the panther responsible for these attacks concluded, and no doubt quite justifiably, that he had found a locality where food was plentiful and easy to get. He decided to live nearby, in preference to moving through the forest in his normal hunt for game, which was far more arduous anyhow. The monsoons then came, and with the heavy rains, pasture grew up everywhere, and it became unnecessary to drive the herds of cattle into the jungle for grazing. Grass sprang up near the village itself and in the few adjacent fields, and the herds were kept close to the village, where they could be more carefully watched. This change, of course, was not relished by the panther, and he became bolder as he was forced by circumstances to stalk the herds in the new pastures. The forest thinned out in the vicinity of the village. while the fields themselves were completely treeless. This made the panther's approach more and more difficult, and often enough the herdsmen saw him as he tried to creep towards their charges. On such occasions, they would shout, throw stones at him, and brandish the staves they carried. These demonstrations would frighten him away. Then as hunger increased, he found that he must choose between abandoning the village herds altogether as prey, and go back to stalking the wild animals of the forests, or adopting a more belligerent policy towards the herdsmen. The panther decided to adopt the latter policy. One evening, he crept as far as possible under cover, and then dashed openly towards the nearest cow. Two herdsmen, standing quite near, saw him coming. They shouted and waved their sticks, but his charge never faltered till he had buried his fangs in the cow's throat. The herdsmen stood transfixed for the few minutes it took for the cow to die. Then they began to hurl stones at the spotted aggressor, while he lay with heaving flanks across the still quivering carcass of his prey. When the stones thudded around, the panther let go his grip on the cow, and with blood-smeared snout growled hideously at the men, his evil countenance contorted and his eyes blazing with hatred. Faced with that hideous visage and those blood-curdling growls, the herdsmen ran away. At this stage of affairs, the villagers requested the local forester to do something to help them, otherwise to enlist help from some other quarter. The forester, whose name was Ramu, had done a bit of shooting himself, and owned a single-barreled 12-bore breech-loading gun. Although it was part of his duties as the representative of the government to check poachers, he himself was accustomed to indulge in a little poaching over water holes and salt licks, his quarry being the various kinds of deer that visited such spots or an occasional jungle pig. As often as was possible, he avoided letting his subordinates, the forest guards, know of these surreptitious activities. But when that was not possible, he made sure of the guards' silence by giving them a succulent leg from the animal he had shot, together with a string of dire threats of what he would do to them if a word about it was breathed to the range officer. So far, Ramu had not tried his weapon against any of the larger carnivora, and when the villagers approached him for help to shoot the panther, he was not over keen to tackle the proposition. But the villagers persisted in their requests, and soon it was made very evident to Ramu that his honor was at stake, for he could not delay indefinitely with vague excuses of being too busy to come to the village, or of having run out of stock of ammunition, and so forth. Therefore, Ramu arrived at the village one morning carrying his weapon. He was hailed as the would-be savior of the situation, and immediately took full advantage of the fact by settling down to a very hearty meal provided by the villagers. After washing this down with a loda, or tumbler of coffee, he belched contentedly and announced his intention of indulging in a nap for an hour before tackling the business for which he had come. Ramu awoke a couple of hours later, by which time it was past midday. He then demanded of the headman that a goat should be provided as bait. This was done, and Ramu set out for the jungle, accompanied by 5 or 6 villagers. Being the forester in charge of the section, he was well acquainted with the locality and had already selected in his mind the tree on which to build his machon. This was a large banyan, growing conveniently at the point where the track from the village and the forest fire line met. It also happened that a nullah intersected the fire line near the same spot. The panther was known to traverse all 3 of these approaches, as had been evidenced by his frequent pug marks, so that Ramu's choice was indeed a wise one. For if the panther walked along the fire line or came up the nullah, he could not help spotting his goat, while he himself, in the machon, could see up and down both these approaches, as well as part of the track leading to the village. On this tree, then, Ramu instructed the villagers who had accompanied him to build a machon 20 feet or so off the ground, and being well skilled in the art of making hideouts himself, contrived to conceal it cleverly with leaves, so that it would be quite unnoticeable to the panther. It was past 4 o'clock that evening before the work was completed. Ramu climbed into the machon, and the goat was then tethered by a rope round its neck to a stake that had been driven into the ground. When the villagers left, the goat, finding itself alone, gazed in the direction of the village path and bleated lustily. Conditions were as perfect as could be, and the panther heard the goat and pounced upon it at about 6. Ramu had loaded his gun with an LG cartridge, which he fired at the panther. There was a loud cough, and the panther somersaulted before dashing off into the undergrowth. The goat, which was already dying from suffocation, and the wound inflicted in its throat, was killed outright by a pellet that passed through its ear into the brain. Ramu waited a while, then descended the banyan tree, and hastily retreated to the village, where he told the people that he was sure he had hit the panther, and had no doubt that they would find him dead the next morning. With daylight, a large party of men assembled, and headed by Ramu, went down to the banyan tree. There they found that the goat had been completely eaten during the night by a hyena. Ramu pointed out the direction in which the panther had leaped, and the whole party of men searched in close formation. It was not long before they came upon a blood trail on the leaves of the bushes in Lantana, indicating that, in truth, he had scored a hit. But of the panther there was no sign, although the party followed the trail for over a mile, before it eventually petered out. For 2 months after this, no fresh attacks on cattle or goats were recorded, and everyone, including Ramu, was sure that the panther had gone away into some thicket and died. Then one evening, a lad of about 16 years was returning to the village along the same forest line. He was alone. Coming around a bend, he saw a panther squatting on his haunches, about 20 yards away, looking directly at him. He halted in his tracks, expecting the panther to behave as an ordinary panther would. But this panther did nothing of the kind. Instead, he changed his position to a crouch and began to snarl viciously. The boy turned around and ran the way he had come, and the panther pursued him. Luckily, at the place he overtook the boy. A piece of rotting wood happened to be lying across the forest line. As the panther jumped on his back and bit through his shoulder near the neck, the boy was borne to earth by the weight, and in falling saw the piece of rotting wood. Terror and desperation lent strength to his hands, and an unusual quickness to his mind. Grasping the wood, he rolled sideways and jammed the end into the panther's mouth. This caused the panther to release his hold, but not before he had severely scratched the boy's arm and thighs with his claws. Springing to his feet, the boy lashed out at him again. This unexpected retaliation by his victim caused the panther to lose courage, and he leaped into the bushes, still grasping the wood that had saved his life. And with blood streaming down his chest, back, arms, and legs, the boy made a staggering run for the village. That was the first attack made upon a human being. The next followed some 3 weeks later, and this time the panther did not run away. It happened that a goat herd was returning with his animals when a panther attacked them and seized upon one. The herdsman was poor, and the herd represented all his worldly wealth. So he tried to save his goat by screaming at the panther as he ran towards him, whirling his staff. It was a brave but silly thing to have done, knowing that a panther was in the vicinity that had recently attacked a human being without provocation. He paid for his foolish bravery with his life, for the panther left the goat and leapt upon him, to clamp his jaws firmly in his throat. The goats ran back to the village. Seeing no herdsman returning with them, some of the villagers wondered what had occurred, but for the moment did not attach any significance to what they had noticed. It transpired that this herdsman was alone and had no relatives, so that it was nearly an hour later and growing dusk before his absence was really accepted as a fact, and it became evident that something had happened to him. It was too late by then to do anything. Next morning, the villagers gathered in a party of about 30 persons, armed with clubs and staves, and left the village to try to find the herdsman. They went down the track leading from the village to the jungle. The hoof marks of the herd of goats as they had run back to the village the previous evening were clearly visible along the trail. They proceeded a little further, and there they came upon the spot where the panther had made the attack. Clearly impressed in the dusty earth were the pug marks of the large spotted cat. There was also a distinct drag mark where the panther had hauled his victim away. Scattered at intervals were a few drops of blood from the throat of the man that had trickled to the ground. But the earth away from the track was sun-baked and hard, and had absorbed the blood, and it was difficult to locate, though the drag mark was quite clear. The panther had taken his victim off the track along which the man had been driving his goats, and had hauled the body into the jungle. But he had not gone very far from where he had originally made his kill, and within about 100 yards, a group of villagers discovered the body of the victim. The chest and a small portion of one thigh had been eaten. Thus, the man-eater of the Yellagiris came into existence. The Yellagiris are a crescent-shaped formation of hills, which is about 95 miles from Bangalore. Many years ago, in 1941 in fact, I had purchased a farm of small acreage in the Yellagiri. I had intended keeping this farm as a weekend resort, but had not found the time to visit it regularly. As a result, the open land was quickly being encroached upon by the ever-prolific Lantana shrub. I had decided to visit this place for about 3 days to supervise the removal of the Lantana. And when I made this visit, I happened to arrive a few days after the death of the herdsman. The coolies I had engaged for the work told me about the panther, of which no news had been published in any of the newspapers. They assured me that it continued to haunt the precincts of the village, for they had again seen its pug marks only the previous day. The news interested me, and I thought I might as well make an attempt to bag the animal. I had brought neither of my rifles with me, but only my 12-bore shotgun, as the Yellagiri abound in jungle fowl, and during the few visits I had made there I had always shot a couple each time for the pot. Further, with this object in view, I had brought along with me only 2 LG cartridges for emergencies, the rest being number 6 shot for the jungle fowl. Therefore, I would have to make sure of the panther with the only 2 LG shells available. I stopped work on the Lantana about midday, and went back with the laborers to explore the ground. It was much as I had expected. The jungle fell away into a narrow belt of Lantana, which ceased only at the few fields that bordered the village. Clearly visible on a footpath at the end of one of these fields was the trail of a panther, a fairly large adult male, judging from his pugs. He had passed that way only the night before. I went to the village and introduced myself to the Patel, or headman, whom I had never met before, and told him how I came to be there. He expressed great pleasure at my presence, and was most enthusiastic in his promises of every cooperation. We held a discussion, and I told the Patel that I would like to buy a goat to tie up as a bait. And here was where the Patel's cooperation was needed, as no goats were available in his village. It was only with much difficulty and considerable delay that he was able to procure one for me from a neighboring hamlet, a kid that was small enough in size to ensure that it would bleat when tied up. The Patel himself accompanied me, and 4 other men, one of them leading the goat, the rest carrying hatchets with which to construct a match-on. They led me back along the track to the place where the herdsman had been attacked, and finally to the spot at which they had found his remains. It was densely overgrown with small bushes of the plant known as the Madras thorn. It was out of the question to sit on the ground there, as the thorns grew so close together as to prevent one from seeing any animal beyond the distance of a couple of yards. So we were compelled to retrace our steps along the track for about 1/4 of a mile. There we came upon quite a large and leafy jackfruit tree, which with its thick leaves growing in profusion seemed to provide the ideal setting for the construction of a match-on. I instructed my followers to build the match-on, and got one of the men to make a stake out of a piece of wood, sharpened it a little at one end, and then hammered it into the hard ground. When all this was ready, I climbed into the machon myself and made an opening in the leaves to face the stake, in such a position that I would have a clear view of the goat and a small portion of the ground around it. By the time we were ready, it was nearly 5 in the evening. As I have already stated, I had not come to the Yellagiri to shoot big game, so I had not brought my night equipment, the torch that I used to clamp to the barrel of my rifle. Instead, I had brought a small 2-cell affair, which I only used in camp. It threw only a diffused beam and was quite inadequate for the work which I now had in hand. Further, having no clamp, I would have to hold the torch itself in my left hand. The outlook was not so good, since I had come during the moonless period of the month, and would have to rely on sounds and my own senses to judge the presence and exact whereabouts of the panther in the darkness would he turn up. Bearing all these facts in mind, I settled down in the machon and made myself as comfortable as possible. Then I instructed the men to tether the goat to the stake and walk back to the village, talking loudly to each other. Not only would their withdrawal in this fashion cause the goat to begin bleeding as it saw them going away, but should the panther be watching anywhere in the vicinity, their noisy departure, coupled with the bleeding of the goat, would induce him to come out early to dinner. According to instructions, the men tied the goat to the stake and began to walk back in the direction of the village, talking loudly. The goat immediately strained at the rope that held it to the stake and started to bleed so loudly and persistently that I mentally congratulated the Patel on the choice of the bait he had selected. I became certain that if the panther was anywhere around, within a mile of this goat, he would surely hear its cries and hasten to his intended victim. But nothing that I expected came to pass. The goat called persistently and loudly, so much so that by the time the sun had set, it had become quite hoarse and its cries dwindled to husky squeaks. Twilight found the goat so hoarse that it appeared to resign itself to the inevitable and a night in the open. Folding its forelegs first, it settled down on the ground and fell asleep. I now knew there was but little chance of the panther locating the goat, unless it actually happened to pass by and practically stumble upon it. Still, I decided to wait till about 9 o'clock and chance my luck. At 9:15 p.m., I decided to abandon the vigil. I shone the torch in the direction of the goat, but the spreading beam hardly reached the sleeping animal, which I could just detect as a faint blur, as I heard it scramble to its feet. Had the panther attacked the goat, I would not have been able to see it properly. So I consoled myself with the thought that perhaps it was just as well the panther had not turned up. Climbing down from the tree, I untied the goat and taking it as tow, went back to the village, where I left it with one of the men who had helped to put up the machon, instructing him to look after it until the next day. Early the following morning, I returned to the village to glean as much additional information about the panther as I could, but there was nothing more that anybody could tell me, beyond the facts already related at the beginning of this story, which I slowly pieced together. Nobody knew exactly from where the panther had come, and nobody could suggest any particular locality in which he might be living. The work on my land occupied the next 3 days, and each evening of those 3 days I spent in the same machon, sitting up with different goats as baits till a few hours before midnight. But all those 3 evenings drew a blank in that I heard no sound of the panther. Each morning, I would scour the vicinity of the machon, the forest lines, and various stream beds, but there were no fresh pug marks of the animal for which I was looking, showing that he had not passed anywhere nearby during those nights. Very probably, he had moved off to some distant part of the Yellagiri hills. On the 4th morning, I left for Bangalore, after handing the village Patel my name and address and money for a telegram, which he was to send by a runner to Jalarpet railway station. Over a month passed, no telegram came, and I decided that the panther was not a regular man-eater, or had perhaps left the Yellagiri hills. I was quite wrong, as events were to prove. 7 weeks passed before the telegram, which I had almost forgotten, arrived. It told me that the mail carrier who brought the post from Jalarpet up the hill to the various villages and settlers at the top, had been killed by the Panther. The telegram did not reach me till after 3 in the afternoon. Nevertheless, by hurrying I was able to catch the Trichinopoli Express, which left Bangalore at 7 o'clock, and reached Jalarpet at 10:30 p.m. I had brought my Petromax lantern with me, and by its bright light walked from the station up the hill to reach the village, 8 miles away, just before 2 a.m. Normally I would not have dared to risk that rough and steep boulder-covered track by night, with a man-eating panther in the vicinity. But I knew that it would be quite safe as long as I had the Petromax burning, my .405 rifle, and haversack of equipment strapped to my back, plus the light hanging from my left hand, made quite a sizable and uncomfortable load up that steep track, and I was drenched in perspiration by the time I reached the top of the hill. The village was still a mile away, and a cold breeze chilled my damp clothes as they dried on my back while I walked along. I awoke the Patel, who in turn awoke most of the village, so that a concourse of 100 dusky faces and gleaming white teeth surrounded me in the light of the Petromax. The Patel offered me food, which I politely declined, but I told him I would be grateful for some hot tea. This was soon prepared, and while sipping it from a large brass utensil belonging to the Patel, I heard the story he had to tell me. Actually, there was nothing much to tell. After my last visit, everybody had been very careful when moving about in the day, particularly in the vicinity of the forests. At night they had remained indoors. Then, as the weeks had passed, without any further signs of the Panther, as always happened, vigilance was correspondingly relaxed. The mail carrier used to ascend the hill early in the morning, leaving Jalarpet at about 6 a.m. from the small post office situated adjacent to the railway station. Postal traffic to the Yellagiri was comparatively small, and the few letters or articles that were destined for the hilltop were placed in individual bags by the sorters on the various mail trains and unloaded at Jalarpet station. The mail carrier, who was to ascend the hill, would open these bags in order to place all their contents into the one bag that he carried up slung across his shoulders. His one protection, which was intended not so much as a weapon of protection, was a short spear on the shaft of which were fitted a number of iron rings. This spear he would carry in his hand, striking the base of it against the ground at every few paces. The rings would jangle against the iron shaft and against each other, making the loud, jangling noise. On that fateful day, the mail carrier had as usual set out from the small post office at Jalarpet at about 6 o'clock in the morning, but he never reached the top of the hill. After the midday meal, a party of men had started to descend the hill bound for Jalarpet. About a quarter of the way down, they noticed the rusty color of dried blood splashed on the rocks that formed a trail. They had stopped to wonder about it when the sharp eyes of one individual had noticed the mail carrier's spear lying away from the track and near a bush. Guessing what had happened, the whole party turned tail and hurried back to the village. There they had gathered reinforcements, including the Patel, and returned eventually to find the partly eaten corpse of the unfortunate mail carrier. The Patel had written out the telegram and sent it by the same party of men to be dispatched to me from Jalarpet station. With all the confusion, it had not reached me till after 3 the following evening. A delay of some 24 hours, although Jalarpet is just 89 miles from Bangalore. I was also informed that the police authorities at Jalarpet had removed the body for inquest and cremation. By the time all this conversation was over, and I had elicited all the information I required, or perhaps it would be more correct to say, all the information that the Patel and the villagers knew about the Panther, it was past 4 in the morning. The Patel lent me a rope cot, which I carried to the outskirts of the village, where I lay down upon it for a brief sleep of 2 hours till dawn, when I awoke not to the familiar calls of the forest, but to the loud yapping of a couple of curs, who were regarding me on the rope cot with very evident suspicion and distaste. As I have said, the Yellagiri Hills do not hold a great deal of regular forest, and there is therefore a complete absence of aboriginal jungle folk of any kind. I realized that I would have to rely upon the villagers and myself to try to discover ways and means of locating the panther. One of the questions I had asked earlier that morning concerned the panther's possible hideout. No definite reply had been given to this, but a couple of cattle grazers had stated that they had on 3 or 4 occasions during the past few weeks observed a panther sunning himself in the afternoon on a rocky ledge of a hill named Piriamalai, or Big Hill, to give it its English translation. The Yellagiri themselves form a plateau at the top, and this Piriamalai is the one and only hill rising above the level of the plateau, and forms the highest peak of the crescent-shaped Yellagiri range. It is nearly 4,500 feet above mean sea level. I went to the Patel's house and found him still asleep, but he soon woke up. I then asked him to call the cattle tenders, who had seen the panther on Piriamalai, and to ask them to accompany me to the hill and point out the particular ledge which the panther was said to frequent. It took some time before these 2 individuals could be persuaded to go with me. They were most unwilling, and I could see that they were definitely scared. However, the Patel used his own methods of persuasion, which included threats of retribution if they refused. So eventually, I was able to set out accompanied by them. Piriamalai is situated about 3 miles to the east of the village, and in the opposite direction to the path from Jalarpet. In all, about 5 miles lay between this hill and the spot where the unfortunate mailman had been killed. In addition, practically all the land between was cultivated. The jungle covering Piriamalai itself receded down the slopes of the Yellagiri range. I was not happy about this, as I felt that the cattle grazers might have seen another panther entirely, and not the one that had killed the postman. Arriving at the base of Piriamalai, my 2 companions pointed to a ledge of rock that jutted out some 300 feet above, and stated that that was the spot where they had seen the panther sunning himself on several afternoons. Thick Lantana scrub grew from the foot of the hill right up to the base of the ledge, and to about halfway up Piriamalai, where the regular forest began. Piriamalai is a rocky hill consisting of piles of boulders, and to look for a panther in that sea of Lantana and among those rocks would be a hopeless task, as the former was impenetrable. So I marked out a place under a tree growing at the foot of the hill, and told the men that we would return to the village and procure a bait, and that they should come back with it and tie it at the spot I had selected. Accordingly, we went back, and the Patel procured for me a donkey. A goat would have been of no use in this case, as I did not intend to sit up with it. Should it be killed, the panther would devour it at one meal, and there would be nothing left to justify his return the following night, whereas the donkey was big enough to warrant the panther coming back for what remained after the first meal. I relied on the fact that if the panther lived anywhere on the hill, from his elevated position, he would be able to see the donkey tied on the lower ground. So I borrowed some stout rope and instructed the cattlemen to take the donkey up and tether it at the spot I had already pointed out to them. This done, the Patel himself and 3 or 4 villagers came along with me to point out the place where the mail carrier had been done to death. It turned out to be at a spot about 1.5 miles from the village, just where the track from Jalarpet passed through a belt of Lantana and rocky boulders. I had, of course, passed the place myself the previous night, when ascending the hill with the lantern, but had not noticed the blood in the lantern light. We came upon a few dried splashes of blood on the trail, and my companions pointed out me a spot nearby to where the unfortunate man had been dragged and partly eaten. As I have already said, his remains had been removed for cremation, so that there was nothing to be gained by remaining there any longer. A cashew nut tree stood beside the trail, about 300 yards higher up, and beneath this tree I asked the Patel to tie another donkey. Then we walked back to the village, and I suggested that a 3rd donkey be tied at some place where the scrub jungle came closest to the village. The Patel once more used his influence to procure 2 more donkeys, and sent them out by different parties of men to be tied, as I had instructed. It was past 1 in the afternoon by the time all this had been done, and I realized that there was nothing more for me to do but await events. I could only hope the Panther would kill one of 3 donkeys that night. To pass the time, I went down to my small farm and pottered about for the rest of that evening. You may be interested to know that this farm of mine consists of only 1.5 acres of land. But it is a very compact farm at that. 3 jack trees, which are of a grafted variety, produce fruit weighing from 2 to 12 pounds each or even more. There are a few guava trees, some peaches, and a vegetable garden. The 2 existing buildings were mud-walled affairs with thick thatched roofs, made from a mixture of jungle grass and stalks of grain. A small rose and croton garden fronts them. At that time, I had about 3 dozen fowls, including leghorns, roads, and black minorcas, and a few ducks. My drinking water comes from a small well, into which I introduced some fish which I had originally brought from Bangalore, to keep the water clean. An interesting feature about this farm was a story that one of the 2 buildings was haunted by the ghost of the brother of the Anglo-Indian lady, from whom I had purchased it in 1941. Lock, stock, and barrel, poultry included, for the sum of 500 rupees, about 35 pounds in English money. This man had died of a reputedly mysterious disease. He had been very much attached to the small farm, and was said to have spent over 25 years thereafter purchasing it as waste land. Then he gave it to his sister, as he had no family of his own. However, as the story went, after his death, passing villagers frequently saw him, standing before the buildings in the evenings, just as dusk was falling. Thereafter, needless to say, the villagers avoided the place. His sister told me nothing about the alleged haunting, till the day after I had purchased the farm, and paid the cash before the sub-registrar, when I had registered the sale deed, probably thinking the ghost would put me off the transaction. Then she told me that her dead brother would sometimes roam about the 2 buildings at night, and also that she had clearly seen him many times in the moonlight, attending the rose trees, which had been his special hobby. She hastened to add that the spirit was quite harmless, made no sound or troublesome manifestation, and just faded away if approached. I have failed to mention that some very ancient furniture came to me with the farm. A bed in each building, a broken-down dressing table, 2 almirahs, and some 3 or 4 rather rickety chairs. The beds were of the old-fashioned sort, having battens. I well remember the first night I slept in one of the buildings, incidentally the one in which the brother had died, for it was a rainy night and the roof of the other building was leaking. I had spread my bedroll without mattress on the batten cot and had laid down to sleep. The hard battens, however, were irksome and pressed against my shoulder blades and back. After failing to induce slumber for some time, I decided that the floor would be far more comfortable. Of course, there were no electric lights, so I had lighted a candle to enable me to remove the bedroll and place it on the floor. When I had extinguished the candle and laid down to sleep, this time I was successful and had fallen asleep immediately. I do not know when I awoke. It was pitch dark. Something heavy and cold and clammy moved and rested against my throat, and what seemed like 2 icy wet fingers extended across either side of my neck. Now, I am not an imaginative person. I am not afraid of the dark, nor am I superstitious. But in a rush of memory, I recollected the dead brother and his ghost, the fact that I had left my torch on the windowsill some feet away, and also that I did not know where I had left the matchbox. These thoughts came simultaneously while the cold, clammy, wet thing distinctly moved, and seemed to press its 2 extended fingers even more tightly on either side of my throat. I could feel my hair rising. To lie there any longer was impossible. With what seemed superhuman energy, I scrambled to my feet and dashed towards the unfamiliar windowsill, where I had left my torch. Probing wildly in the dark, I at last found that elusive torch. I pressed the button, expecting to see the ghost, and its clammy hands, cold from the grave, before me. Instead, there on the floor was quite the largest toad I had ever seen in my life. A huge, black, slimy fellow, almost a foot long. This just goes to show what human nerves can do. Hardly a few seconds earlier, I had been scared stiff by the thought of the supernatural and the unknown. Now I laughed to myself as I guided the toad with the toe of my slippered foot to the door and then out into the rain. Next morning, all 3 donkey baits were alive, and so I spent the day on my land. No one had any news to give about the panther. Another night passed, and the following morning found all 3 of the donkeys still in the land of the living. After the death of the mail carrier, the post was conveyed up the hill by 3 men instead of 1. The party consisting of the relief mail carrier, who had replaced the poor fellow that had been killed, together with 2 chowkidars, literally watchmen, who had been pressed into service to accompany him as bodyguards. These 3 men excitedly reported at the village that they had seen a panther sunning himself on the ledge of a rock, about a quarter of a mile downhill from the place where the previous mail carrier had been done to death. Upon hearing this news, the Patel had dispatched a villager to run and tell me. Taking my rifle, I accompanied him back to the village, where both the chowkidars offered to come along with me to point out the rock. We covered the distance of a little over 2 miles in good time, but only the bare rock ledge stared us in the face. The panther that had been lying there, man-eater or otherwise, had gone, and it was too hot, too rocky, and too hopeless to search for him among the piles of boulders. However, the news was encouraging, as it indicated the panther was still in the vicinity. Before returning to the village and my small farm, I once again examined the bait under the cashew tree, and mentally selected the branch on which I would fix my match on if occasion arose. That night brought good luck, though bad for the donkey beneath the cashew nut tree, for the panther killed and ate about half of him during the hours of darkness. Early next morning, this fact was discovered by the party of men whom I had delegated to inspect, feed, and water each one of the 3 baits in turn. They came back and told me, after having taken the precaution to cover the remains of the donkey with branches, to protect it from being devoured to the bones by vultures. I finished an early lunch, and with my greatcoat, torch, and flask of tea and some biscuit, proceeded to the village, where I readily obtained the loan of a charpoy from the Patel. 4 willing helpers carried this to the cashew nut tree, where it was slung up and secured with the ropes. I personally supervised the camouflaging of the charpoy. All arrangements were eventually completed to my satisfaction, and the only fault that I could find was that the match-on was rather low, not more than 10 feet from the ground. It was about 2:30 in the afternoon when the party of men who had accompanied me left, after I had instructed them to return at dawn, in case I did not go back to the village myself during the night. I sat back on the match-on and made myself as comfortable as possible. It was a sweltering afternoon. Towards dusk, a single peacock wailed in the distance, and a couple of nightjars flitted around the tree. Except for them, there were no signs of any other animals or birds. Then the shadows of night descended. Darkness fell around me. It was a moonless night. The heavy clouds scuttled across the sky, some of them merging with the tops of the Yellagiri range. No friendly stars shone down, and the darkness became intense. I would have to rely on my sense of hearing. Thoughts of all kinds creep into a man's mind on such occasions, some pleasant, some otherwise, and some reminiscent. I remember that evening, for some unaccountable reason, I began thinking of some way of inventing a new sort of bicycle. Something that one could propel fast and for long distances with the minimum of effort. Is it not strange what the human mind may think of when it is forced to be idle? My reveries concerning this bicycle were disturbed by what seemed like a faint sigh. I knew the panther had arrived and was standing over the dead donkey. I waited expectantly for the sound of the meat being torn and bones being crunched. which would have assured me that the panther was tucking in at the donkey. But instead I heard nothing. I glanced down at the luminous dial of my watch, which showed that it was 20 minutes to 9. I waited without moving. 9 o'clock came and passed, and then, from a section of boulders to my right, I heard a deep growl, followed in a few seconds by another. Somehow the panther had become aware of my presence. He could not have smelt me, as panthers have little or no sense of smell. He could not have heard me, for I had made no sound. Therefore, he had either looked up inadvertently and become aware of the match on, or some intuition had warned him. In either case, he now knew a human being was there. Soon, the growls increased both in volume and tempo. The panther was now making a terrific noise. And then out he came, with the peculiar coughing roar, made by every charging panther. As he reached the base of the cashew nut tree, I leaned over the edge of the cot, pushing aside the camouflaging twigs to point the rifle downwards, while pressing the switch of my torch. I knew I had to be quick. The panther would reach me in no time. As bad luck would have it, one of the camouflaging branches fell down upon the panther. No doubt this served to delay, if not actually to deter, his progress up the tree. But it also served to screen him completely from the light of the torch. As I looked downwards, I just saw the branch shaking violently, and guessed that it covered the panther. At that moment, I did a foolish thing. Instead of waiting till the animal could break clear of the offending branch, I quickly aimed at the spot where I felt his body would be and pressed the trigger. The report of the shot was followed by the sound of a falling body, as the panther went hurtling backwards to the ground. For a second, I thought I had succeeded in killing him. But that thought lasted only for a second. For no sooner did he touch the ground than he jumped clear of the branch, in which he had become entangled, and I caught a momentary glimpse of his yellow form, leaping into the undergrowth before I had a chance to work the underlever that would reload my rifle. I shone the torch at the spot where he had disappeared, but neither sight nor sound of him or his further progress came to me. Silence reigned supreme. He might be lying dead in the bushes, or he might be wounded there, or he might have disappeared, and be a long way off. There was no way of knowing. I waited until 11:30 p.m. The loud whistling from the engine of the incoming Madras coach and express decided me to come down from the tree. I came down from the cashew nut tree, and by the light of my torch made my way back to the village, where, before going on to my farm, I related all that had happened to the Patel and the excited villagers. Early next morning, I came back to the village, where at least 20 willing men assembled and offered to help me. We proceeded to the cashew nut tree, and the site of the previous night's occurrences. The remains of the donkey had been untouched. A hole in the ground directly below the tree showed where my bullet had buried itself in the earth, nor was a speck of blood to be seen anywhere. We thoroughly searched among the bushes into which the panther had disappeared, but it was clear that I had missed entirely, and that my bullet of the night before had failed to score. The panther had got completely away. Ill-tempered and disgusted with myself, I returned with the men to the village, where I told the Patel that my time was up and that I would have to return to Bangalore. However, I asked him to send me another telegram should there be further developments. That was the end of the first round of my encounter with the Yellagiri man-eating panther. Contrary to expectations, I heard nothing more from the Patel. When 2 months had elapsed, I wrote him a letter and received a reply within a few days stating that there had been no further news of the animal. 9 more weeks passed before the next news arrived in the form of a telegram from the Patel, dispatched from Jalarpet railway station, stating that the panther had reappeared and once again killed a human being. The telegram asked me to come at once. When I reached the Patel's village, he greeted me with his usual hospitality. Then he told me that the panther had attacked and killed a young woman 3 days ago, when she had gone to draw water from a stream running past the base of Periyamalai Hill. He also informed me that the people of the village to which the girl had belonged had arrived shortly afterwards and recovered the remains of the victim for cremation. Apparently, the panther had eaten but little of the unfortunate woman, perhaps because it had been disturbed by the party of men searching for her. This time, I decided to tie a live bait in the form of a goat and sit up over it, as my stay on the Yellagiri could not exceed 4 days, as I had only that much leave. So the Patel offered to procure one for me from the neighboring village. It was 2 in the afternoon before the man who had been sent to fetch the animal returned with a black goat that was rather old, in the sense that it was past the stage where it would bleat for a long time when left alone, and so help to attract the panther. Secondly, as I have said, it was a black goat. Black or white goats occasionally cause suspicion among certain panthers. A brown bait, whether goat, dog, or bull, is generally the best to use in that they resemble in color the wild animals that form the panther's natural food. However, there was no time now to change the goat, and I would have to make the best of circumstances. The Patel and 4 or 5 men accompanied me, the latter carrying axes, ropes, and the same charpoy I had used on the last occasion. We reached the village to which the girl had belonged in a little under an hour. There another couple of men joined my party, who offered to point out the exact spot at which the young woman had been killed. It was perhaps 3/4 of a mile from the village. A stream bearing a trickle of water ran from west to east and skirted the base of Piriamalai Hill. This stream was sandy and bordered by a thick outcrop of mixed lantana and wait-a-bit thorns. At the spot where the girl had been attacked, a shallow hole had been dug by the villagers to form a pool for watering their cattle. When the weather became dry and the rest of the stream ceased to flow, it was to this place that the girl had come for water when she had been killed. The lantana grew quite close to the pool, and it was evident that the man-eater had stalked her under cover of this thicket, and from there had made his final pounce. As matters stood, this panther had again confirmed that he was most unusual in his habits, even for a man-eater. He had repeatedly attacked his human victim in broad daylight. Only tigers do this, as man-eating panthers, being inherent cowards at heart, usually confine their activities to the hours of darkness. I was inclined to think that this animal was perhaps already lying up in the thicket before the girl arrived, and could not resist the temptation of a meal so readily offered. With this idea in mind, I went down on hands and knees and began a close examination of the lantana bushes and the ground in the vicinity, where I shortly found confirmation of my theory, for one of the bushes provided ample shelter for a regular lie-up. Beneath it, the carpet of dried lantana leaves rendered impossible the chance of finding any visible track, but a faintly prevailing odor of wild animal inclined me to confirm my guess as correct, and that the panther used this place now and then to lie up, as it offered ideal proximity for attack on any prey that might approach the pool to drink. As I studied these conditions, an idea suddenly came to me. I would tether the goat to a stake beside the pool, to make it appear like an animal that had come there to drink, and I would forestall the panther's arrival by hiding myself beneath that very same lantana bush. Should he hear the goat or catch a glimpse of it from higher up the hill, he would make straight for this point of attack and would find me waiting for him. I explained my idea to the Patel and the men who had accompanied me. The stake, which we had brought along, was accordingly hammered deep into the sand, with the aid of a stone from the stream bed. I crept under the bush and took my time in making myself quite comfortable for the night. I also clamped the torch to the barrel of my rifle and tested it to see that it was in good order. Finally, I took a long drink of tea from my water bottle before ordering the men to tether the goat to the stake by its hind legs. It was hot and still beneath the lantana, and long before sunset it was quite dark where I was sitting. The goat had bleated a few times at the beginning and then had stopped. I could only hope that it would begin calling again when darkness fell, but I was sorely disappointed. Occasionally, I had heard the sounds made by the goat as it kicked and struggled against the tethering rope, but these had now lapsed into silence, and I came to the inevitable conclusion that the damned animal had gone to sleep. The panther did not come. No sounds penetrated the silence under the bush, not even the calls of a night bird. Time moved on its long and tedious course. The luminous hands of my wristwatch very slowly clocked the passing hours. I felt drowsy, but dared not give in to my inclination to close my eyes, even for a few fitful seconds. The graying light of a new day gradually filtered in. I came out of that bush. The goat, which had been lying curled up and fast asleep by the stake, lazily got to its feet, stretched leisurely, wagged its stumpy tail. I untethered that wretched animal, which followed me back to the village where the Patel lived. That worthy, with the same party of men who had accompanied us the day before, was just about to set forth to see how I had fared. Telling him to return the black goat, I said that I would snatch a few hours' sleep, and then go myself to find a more satisfactory bait. I went to my farm and slept till noon. I was feeling hungry when I awoke, so I opened a tin of salmon, which I ate with some bread I had brought with me from Bangalore. While eating my lunch, I brewed a second kettle of tea to put into my water bottle. Gathering the necessary equipment for another night's vigil, I returned to the Patel's village. I took the Patel along with me to add force to my argument, and walked to the village where the goats were available. There, after some picking and choosing, followed by some red-hot bargaining, I was able to select a half-grown animal that was more likely to bleat. It was past 3:30 p.m. when we set out for the place where I had sat up the night before. But really there was no hurry, as the spot had already been selected. Before 5 o'clock, I had crept into the bush. The new goat was tethered, and the men were on their way back. Hardly were they out of sight, the goat began to bleat, and he kept this up incessantly. I silently congratulated myself on my selection. With evening, it again became quite dark beneath the Lantana. The goat called loudly, and I waited expectantly for the panther. An hour passed. Then I heard an almost imperceptible rustle, the faintest sound of a dry twig being trodden upon, and I sensed the panther was coming. The crucial moment had almost arrived. Now I had to be careful not to shine the torch before the panther was fully in view. If I did so, I knew he would disappear. On the other hand, if I delayed too long, he might see me first and perhaps make a charge, or even vanish. With all my senses at full stretch, I waited. There were no fresh rustlings or other sounds. Then I heard a faint hiss. Instinctively, I knew the panther had seen or sensed me. He had curled back his lips in a snarl, preparatory to the growl that would most likely follow. That curling of his lips had occasioned the slight hissing sound I had heard. It was now or never. My thumb went down on the switch button of the torch. Its beam sprang right into the twin reddish-white eyes of the panther. I could clearly see his face and chest perhaps 10 feet away. Aiming quickly at the throat, I pressed the trigger of the Winchester. The panther appeared to come forward a pace. Then he reared up on his hind legs, but not before my second bullet took him full in the chest. He fell over backwards, out of sight, and threshed the bushes for a few seconds. Next came the unmistakable gurgling sounds of a dying animal, then silence. I waited another half hour before deciding to take the risk of leaving the bush. I thought it reasonably safe to do so, as I was almost sure the panther was dead. Holding the cocked rifle before me, I crawled out of cover and stood beside the goat. My first impulse was to cut it loose and take it in tow along with me. Then the thought came to my mind that the panther I had fired at might not have been the man-eater after all, but just an ordinary animal. If that were so, I would need to exercise every precaution in returning to the Patel's village in the darkness, and could not afford to hamper myself by leading a goat. That would necessarily distract my attention. So I left it where it was and set out for the Patel's abode, where I arrived after slow and cautious walking. The people were still awake, and I told them what had happened. Then I went to my farm for a sound night's sleep. Next morning, we found the panther where he had fallen, an old male with a somewhat craggy and pale coat. He showed every sign of being the man-eater, for his canine teeth were worn down with old age, and his claws were blunt and frayed. But only time would tell whether I had bagged the real culprit. By noon, I was on my way down the hill with his pelt. Many years have elapsed since that incident took place, but no more people have been killed on the Yellagiri ranges, and so I am reasonably sure I succeeded that night in bringing the man-eater to back. Hey there, if you made it this far, please don't forget to subscribe.